If a man builds an empire by controlling everyone around him, what happens when the one person he thought was powerless turns out to hold the key to destroying it? The wind screamed through the narrow street, hurling sheets of cold rain against the towering glass facade of the Beaumont penthouse. Lightning split the sky in violent flashes, illuminating the scene playing out on the marble steps, a scene no one in their right mind would ever forget. "Get out." Edward Beaumont's voice was like the crack of a whip, sharp enough to slice through the storm. His hand gripped the ornate doorframe, his tailored suit untouched by the rain spilling past him. At his feet, clutching a small suitcase, stood Lila, his wife, 8 months pregnant, shivering so violently her teeth chattered. Her dark hair clung to her face, dripping from the downpour. "Edward, please. You don't mean this," she begged, her voice trembling more from heartbreak than from the cold. She shifted the suitcase to one hand, the other instinctively cradling her swollen belly. "It's not safe. Look at the weather. The baby." "Don't you dare bring up that baby," Edward spat, his eyes narrowing. "You think I don't know what you've been doing behind my back? You think I'm going to let you stay here after humiliating me in front of everyone?" Rainwater trickled down Lila's cheeks, mixing with hot tears she refused to wipe away. "I haven't humiliated you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Edward, you're angry about things that aren't true. I've never." "Enough," he roared, stepping forward. The suitcase handle was ripped from her grip, flung into the wet night where it tumbled down the steps. The thud echoed, swallowed instantly by the thunder. "You have 10 seconds before I lock this door. You can go to your precious lawyer friends. Maybe they'll give you a couch to sleep on." The wind caught her coat, pulling it open to reveal the full curve of her pregnancy. A faint kick pressed against her ribs, as if the baby inside sensed the danger outside. "Edward, I have nowhere to go tonight. At least wait until morning. Please, I'm begging you." "You should have thought of that before you embarrassed me at the dinner." His tone was ice, his gaze hard as steel. "Now get out of my sight." She stepped back onto the rain-slick marble, one hand gripping the railing for balance. A blinding flash lit up the street, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The sudden burst of light showed a man transformed, his jaw tight, his eyes unrecognizable from the ones that had once looked at her with love. Her shoes slipped slightly on the wet step. She steadied herself, forcing her body to turn toward the street. But the weight of the baby made her movements slow, careful. The storm howled around her, pushing her forward. "You'll regret this," she whispered. Not as a threat, but as a truth she knew he couldn't yet see. Edward slammed the door so hard the gold-plated knocker rattled. The sound echoed in her ears as she made her way down the stairs, the rain hitting her face like icy needles. The suitcase lay half open at the bottom step, clothes spilling out into puddles. She crouched to gather them, her fingers stiff from the cold. A sudden horn blared from the street. A passing cab slowed, the driver leaning over to shout through the open window. "Lady, you need a ride? It's crazy out here." Before she could answer, her foot slid on the slit curb. The world tilted. Her arms flailed for balance, but the suitcase yanked her sideways. Pain shot up her side as she landed hard on the pavement. Her hands flew to her belly. For one heart-stopping second, everything went still. Then, movement. The baby kicked again, but weaker this time. Lila's breath hitched. "Please, no, not now," she whispered to the life inside her. The cab driver jumped out, his shoes splashing through the water. "Ma'am, you okay?" He crouched, reaching to help her up, but she winced and shook her head. I need to get to a hospital." Her voice was barely audible over the rain. He grabbed the suitcase and ushered her into the back seat. She sank into the worn leather, one hand pressing against her belly, the other gripping the armrest. Her mind was a blur, fear for the baby, disbelief at what had just happened, and a searing image of Edward's face as he shut her out. As the cab pulled away, she looked back. Through the sheets of rain, she thought she saw the silhouette of a figure at the upstairs window, tall, motionless, watching. Whether it was Edward or just her imagination, she couldn't tell. The driver's voice cut through her thoughts. "Which hospital, ma'am?" "St. David's," she said quickly. Her obstetrician was there. Maybe this was just a scare. She leaned her head back, closing her eyes. But the rumble of the cab's engine couldn't drown out the memory of Edward's words, laced with venom. And beneath it all, a new thought began to take shape. If she and the baby survived this night, she wouldn't just walk away. She would make him answer for it. Because no man, millionaire or not, throws a pregnant woman into a storm and walks away unscathed. Long before Lila Beaumont stood shivering in the storm outside her own home, she had been Lila Hart, just another small-town girl with big-city dreams. Her childhood had been far from glamorous. She grew up in Brookhaven, a quiet town tucked between rolling hills and endless cornfields, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business. Her father, Charles Hart, owned a small repair shop on Main Street. Her mother, Ruth, worked part-time at the library and full-time at keeping the family together. Money was always tight. Summers were spent fixing hand-me-down bikes instead of vacationing at the beach. Winters meant layering sweaters indoors because heating oil was expensive. Yet, despite the financial strain, Lila's parents made sure she never felt poor in spirit. Her mother's warmth was an anchor, her father's work ethic, a compass. From an early age, Lila learned how to stretch a dollar and keep a smile. She was the girl who could mend a dress for the school dance with nothing but a needle and a spool of thread. The one who would tutor younger kids for a few extra dollars, then spend that money buying groceries for the neighbor whose husband was out of work. By 17, she was determined to leave Brookhaven, not because she didn't love it, but because she craved something more. More opportunity, more challenge, more life. She earned a scholarship to Emerson University in Boston, where she studied marketing and communications. It was her first taste of a world much larger than the one she had known. Boston was noisy, bustling, intoxicating. Lila worked part-time at a coffee shop near campus, serving lattes to hurried executives and sleepy graduate students. It was there she first noticed the difference between people who counted every penny and those who didn't even notice money leaving their wallets. Her first encounter with Edward Beaumont wasn't cinematic. No spilled coffee, no chance meeting in the rain. He came in every Thursday at 8:15 a.m., ordered a black Americano, and spent exactly 7 minutes scrolling through his phone while waiting. His presence was magnetic, not because of his looks, though his tall frame, tailored coats, and perfectly combed dark hair made him stand out, but because of the air around him. He was the kind of man who moved like the world would shift to make way. For weeks, they exchanged nothing more than polite smiles. Then one morning, the shop's Wi-Fi crashed, and Edward, impatient, tapping his gold watch, muttered something under his breath. Lila, who was wiping the counter, quipped, "You'd think someone with a watch like that could afford his own internet." It was a risky comment, but instead of offense, he laughed, a deep, surprising sound that made her blush. He asked her name. She asked what he did. "Real estate investments," he said vaguely, though she later learned that was an understatement. At the time, she didn't know his net worth could buy her entire hometown 10 times over. Their relationship moved quickly. He took her to restaurants where the waiters addressed him by name, to art auctions where champagne flowed like water, to penthouses with views so high they made her dizzy. At first, she felt out of place, the small-town girl in borrowed heels. But Edward had a way of making her believe she belonged. "I like that you're different," he told her once over dinner at an Italian place with a month-long reservation list. "You're not like the women in my world. You're real." She believed him. After graduation, she landed an entry-level job at a marketing agency. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She loved the creative rush of pitching campaigns, the late nights brainstorming with her team. Edward encouraged her at first, until they married. The wedding was nothing like the ones back home. It was a 3-day event at a vineyard in Napa, complete with designer gowns, imported flowers, and a guest list that read like a Fortune 500 directory. Lila's parents were overwhelmed by the spectacle, but proud. Her father whispered to her before walking her down the aisle, "Remember who you are, honey. Don't let the big city make you forget." At first, marriage to Edward felt like a dream. He spoiled her with gifts she never asked for, diamond earrings, handbags worth more than her old car. He took her to Paris for their first anniversary, to the Maldives for their second. But somewhere along the way, the man who once loved her difference began to resent it. He wanted her home when he got back from work, dressed and ready for charity galas or client dinners. He wanted her opinion only when it matched his. And slowly, the woman who once thrived on independence began shrinking to fit the mold he had for her. By the time she was pregnant, she had left her job at his urging. "You won't need it," he'd said. "Besides, this is more important." She told herself it was temporary, that once the baby was older she'd go back to work. But the longer she was away, the more she felt her old self slipping away. Edward's world was full of polished veneers and calculated appearances. He controlled every narrative, every photograph, every social media post, every story their friends heard about them. And Lila, with her growing belly and fading voice, fit neatly into the picture he wanted the world to see. But behind closed doors, cracks were spreading. Arguments sparked over small things. Her spending too much on groceries, her not answering his calls fast enough, her forgetting to attend one of his work events because she wasn't feeling well. Still, she told herself he loved her, that the stress of work made him short-tempered, that once the baby came, everything would change. What she didn't know was that Edward's patience was running thinner than the veneer of perfection he showed to the world. And while she was knitting baby blankets and researching cribs, he was growing colder, harder, and looking for a way out. That's how the woman who once dreamed of skyscrapers and city lights found herself on the marble steps of a penthouse, soaked to the bone, suitcase in hand, pleading with the man she thought would protect her. She had built her life on trust, trust in her parents' values, trust in her own resilience, and most dangerously, trust in Edward's love. That night in the storm shattered it all, and somewhere deep inside, past the fear and heartbreak, a spark lit. It was small now, but it would grow. Because Lila Beaumont had survived storms before, and this time she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her child. The Beaumont penthouse wasn't just a home, it was a monument to Edward's ego. Perched on the top floor of a 60-story tower in the heart of Manhattan, it had a panoramic view of the city that made guests gasp the moment they stepped inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like an ever-changing piece of art. From the east balcony, you could watch the sunrise spill gold over the East River. From the west, you could see the city lights glitter like fallen stars over the Hudson. Inside, everything was curated for maximum impact. The living room alone could swallow Lila's entire childhood home 3 times over. Italian marble floors stretched beneath crystal chandeliers that looked as though they had been stolen from a European palace. Modern art, pieces Edward had bought at auctions just to outbid his rivals, hung on the walls, some worth more than most people's lifetimes. It was beautiful. It was cold. The air was always faintly perfumed with imported lilies, changed daily by a florist who arrived in a uniformed van. White leather sofas were arranged to face the view, not the people sitting on them. Even the throw blankets were cashmere, folded so precisely it felt like a crime to use them. Lila had tried in the early days to make it feel like a home. She'd placed framed photos of their trips on the shelves, Edward laughing on a boat in Santorini, Lila holding a gelato in Rome. But one day, she came home to find them gone, replaced by abstract sculptures and glossy coffee table books. Edward had shrugged when she asked, "We have to keep things neutral for guests. This isn't some cozy cottage." The penthouse also served as Edward's unofficial stage. Every month, he hosted dinners for clients, politicians, and other members of New York's elite. The kitchen was fitted with state-of-the-art appliances Lila rarely touched because caterers handled the food. The dining table, a 12-foot slab of polished walnut, had been imported from Italy and cost more than Lila's college education. It wasn't just the home, it was the building. The tower, known as the Orion, was famous for its exclusivity. The lobby gleamed with black granite and brass accents, manned by doormen in tailored uniforms. Residents were chauffeured in and out in black luxury sedans provided by the building's private fleet. A rooftop helipad made quick getaways to the Hamptons or Aspen, effortless. Privacy was paramount. You couldn't even step into the elevator without a keycard that tracked your movements. And yet, for all that control, the walls sometimes felt like they were closing in on Lila. She remembered the first time she realized the penthouse wasn't really hers. It was during a holiday party Edward threw for his inner circle. Lila had been chatting with a friend of one of his clients when she excused herself to get a drink from the bar in the den. But as she approached, she overheard Edward speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone. "This place? It's my sanctuary, my kingdom," he said. "Every inch of it is mine. No one tells me what to do here. Not the board, not the press, not even her." The way he said "her," without using her name, stuck with Lila. Still, she told herself she was being sensitive, that the penthouse was a shared space, that the feeling of being a guest in her own home was just in her head. But as the years passed, the evidence piled up. The security team answered to Edward, not her. Packages addressed to Lila were opened for inspection. Her suggestion to redecorate the nursery, just to make it warmer, was shot down because it wouldn't photograph well for the family Christmas card. The setting wasn't just grand, it was isolating. Every surface gleamed, but the place lacked the lived-in warmth she'd grown up with. There were no scuffed floors from years of footsteps, no mismatched mugs in the cupboard, no worn spots on the couch where someone always sat. And beyond the penthouse, Edward's world sprawled across the city. His main office occupied the top floors of a skyscraper in Midtown, a sleek, glass-walled fortress filled with minimalist furniture and people who moved with the precision of clockwork. Lila visited a few times in the early days, charmed by the idea of bringing him lunch like she used to when they were dating. But the receptionists looked at her like she was a distraction, and Edward's assistant always made it clear she needed to call ahead next time. Then there were the events. Edward thrived in rooms full of people who measured worth in square footage and stock options. Gala season was his favorite. Black tie evenings at the Met, charity auctions at the Plaza, political fundraisers in hidden penthouse gardens. Lila, draped in designer gowns chosen by Edward's stylist, was paraded as the perfect wife, poised, silent, smiling. She knew her role. In Edward's world, setting mattered as much as the people in it. He built his life like a movie set, every scene designed to make him look untouchable. And for a while, she played along, thinking she was part of the story. But as the stormy night proved, she wasn't the co-star. She was just a prop he could remove when she no longer fit the scene. That night, the penthouse, soaring above the city, wrapped in glass and steel, looked down on her like it was mocking her. She'd spent years trying to make it feel like home, only to be thrown out into the rain. And now, every glimmering chandelier and polished surface seemed to whisper the same truth. This was never yours. From the hospital bed later that night, she would stare out the window at the skyline. Somewhere in that sea of glittering lights, the penthouse stood tall and indifferent. It was the stage Edward had chosen for his life. But she was done playing her part. Because one day soon, she would walk back into that world. Not as a guest, not as an accessory, but as the woman who owned the story. And when that day came, the setting wouldn't be his sanctuary anymore. It would be the place he lost everything. Edward Beaumont was the kind of man you could see coming before he walked into the room. Not because of his height or his looks, though both were undeniably striking, but because of the invisible current of power he carried. People turned their heads when he passed. Waiters straightened their posture, assistants scrambled to open doors, and competitors measured their words carefully. On paper, he was the embodiment of the American dream. The son of a construction foreman and a school teacher, Edward claimed to have built his fortune from scratch. The press loved that narrative, the scrappy kid from Jersey who clawed his way into Manhattan's most exclusive circles. By 35, he had transformed a modest real estate portfolio into a billion-dollar empire, his name stamped on skyscrapers, luxury condos, and resort developments around the globe. Magazines called him visionary. Industry peers called him ruthless. Edward cultivated both reputations with precision. At charity galas, he was all charm, holding doors for socialites, leaning in attentively during small talk, laughing at jokes even when they weren't funny. His handshake was firm, his eye contact unwavering, his smile perfectly timed. He donated to causes that made headlines and avoided those that didn't. When cameras flashed, he knew exactly which side to face, his jawline catching the light just so. But behind closed doors, the charm evaporated. Lila had seen the shift early in their marriage. At first, it was subtle, a condescending tone when she offered an opinion about his business, a sigh when she didn't understand a technical detail, a sharp look when she interrupted him at a dinner party. Later, it became harder to ignore. The way he would cut her off mid-sentence, the names he'd call her when they argued, the icy silence that could stretch for days. Edward liked control. He liked things his way, on his timeline, with no deviations. In public, he would drape an arm around Lila's waist and beam like the perfect husband. In private, he would critique the way she folded laundry, the meals she cooked, even the sound of her voice when she spoke on the phone. He had a temper, though he rarely raised his voice. His anger was quieter than shouting, more dangerous too. It came in the form of calculated words, each chosen to cut just deep enough. "You'd be nothing without me," he told her once, after she questioned one of his decisions. "Remember that before you start thinking you have options." Money had given him more than just comfort. It had given him a sense of untouchability. He moved through life convinced that rules were for other people. Parking tickets disappeared. Contractors bent building codes in his favor. Politicians invited him to private dinners where laws were discussed like chess moves. When Edward wanted something, or someone, he didn't ask twice. There were whispers, of course. Rumors about late nights at upscale lounges, about women who seemed to appear on his arm during business trips. Lila tried to ignore them, telling herself they were just that, rumors. But deep down, she knew Edward's ambition didn't stop at boardrooms and balance sheets. His relationships, like his real estate deals, were transactional. If someone added value to his life, they stayed. If not, they were replaced. To the outside world, Edward was a golden boy who could do no wrong. His name on a guest list guaranteed media coverage. His opinion could sway investors. His signature could launch or sink a multi-million-dollar project. And he was careful to maintain that image. Even when his marriage to Lila began to crack, he kept the facade intact. At events, he still introduced her as my beautiful wife, still posed with his hand over her belly when she became pregnant, still kissed her cheek for the cameras. But in private, the pregnancy became another point of control. He monitored what she ate, criticized her weight gain, and dismissed her complaints about fatigue. "Women have been doing this for centuries," he'd say when she mentioned discomfort. "You're not special." Edward's cruelty wasn't always loud. It was in the little things. In the way he'd cancel her plans with friends without telling her. In the way he'd forget to relay messages from her family. In the way he made her feel like she was constantly auditioning for the role of his wife, and that one wrong move would get her replaced. That stormy night on the marble steps was the culmination of years of small, deliberate cuts. By then, Edward had convinced himself he was justified. In his mind, Lila had failed to play her part. She'd embarrassed him at a dinner by correcting a detail in a story he told. A minor fact, but enough to bruise his ego in front of a table of investors. Edward didn't forgive bruised egos. When he shoved her suitcase into the rain, it wasn't just about that night. It was about sending a message, not just to Lila, but to himself. He wanted to prove he could discard her without consequence, that she was replaceable. What he didn't realize was that his public and private worlds were on a collision course. The same arrogance that made him believe he was untouchable would blind him to the danger of underestimating her. In Edward's mind, the story was over. He'd written her out of the script. By morning, he'd be back in his penthouse, sipping coffee while the city hummed beneath him, the storm just a memory. But storms have a way of leaving wreckage behind, and sometimes that wreckage comes back stronger than before. Edward Beaumont would learn that lesson the hard way. Because the woman he'd thrown into the rain was about to step out of the shadows he'd pushed her into. And when she did, she wouldn't just challenge him. She'd dismantle the empire he thought was indestructible. The storm outside had been brewing for hours, but inside the Beaumont penthouse, the tension was far worse. It was supposed to be an intimate dinner for a handful of Edward's most important investors, a night to celebrate the launch of his newest luxury development in Dubai. The dining table gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, each place setting arranged with military precision. Lila had spent the afternoon trying to look the part Edward demanded. A fitted sapphire dress, pearls, her hair in soft waves that framed her face. She moved slowly, careful not to strain herself. At 8 months pregnant, even the smallest exertion felt heavier. She had hoped the night would be civil. That Edward, at least in front of his guests, would keep his temper in check. She was wrong. The first crack in the facade came over the appetizers. Seated beside Edward, Lila was half listening to a conversation about projected returns when one of the guests, a gray-haired man named Simon Aldridge, asked about her thoughts on the project. "I think the location is impressive," Lila said with a polite smile. "But I do wonder how the company plans to address the water shortage in that region." "It could." Edward's hand tightened on her knee under the table. His smile didn't falter, but his voice was razor-sharp. "Lila, let's leave the technical talk to the experts. You're here to enjoy yourself, not worry about logistics." A ripple of awkwardness moved around the table. Lila's cheeks burned, but she said nothing. She knew better than to push back in public. Then came the toast. Edward stood, raising his glass to the room. "To our continued success," he said, his voice carrying over the clinking of crystal, "and to the people who make it possible." He gestured toward his investors, his team, even the chef who'd prepared the meal. But not once did his gaze fall on Lila. It was subtle, but she felt the omission like a slap. By dessert, the storm outside had turned violent. Rain battered the windows, lightning split the sky, and the distant rumble of thunder vibrated through the floor. Lila excused herself to use the restroom, taking a moment to breathe. She was tired, her back ached, her feet throbbed, and her baby shifted restlessly inside her. When she returned, she stopped just outside the dining room, hidden from view. Edward was speaking to Simon and another investor, his voice lower now but still audible over the storm. "She's been difficult lately," he said with a practiced sigh. "Pregnancy hormones. You know how it is. Can't take her anywhere without worrying she'll say the wrong thing." The men chuckled knowingly. Lila's stomach turned. She had been many things in her life, poor, underestimated, even naive, but never a liability, until Edward made her one. When she stepped back into the room, she carried herself differently. Her head was high, her eyes clear. If Edward noticed, he didn't show it. The final straw came minutes later, after the guests had begun donning coats and collecting umbrellas. One of them, a woman named Clarissa Vance, offered to call Lila a car so she wouldn't have to walk in the rain to the garage. Before Lila could answer, Edward's voice cut through. "Don't bother, she's leaving for good tonight." The room went silent. Even the storm seemed to pause. Lila blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "What?" Edward stepped closer, his smile a dangerous imitation of charm. "You've embarrassed me for the last time. Pack your things, now." A few of the guests laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but Edward's expression left no doubt. He meant it. "Edward," she began, her voice trembling, "we can talk about this after." "No," he said, louder now. "You're leaving, tonight. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here another minute." Gasps broke out around the table. Clarissa's hand flew to her mouth. Simon looked down, suddenly fascinated by his shoes. No one moved to intervene. Lila's pulse roared in her ears. She felt the baby shift again, a sharp jab against her ribs, as if urging her to stand her ground. But Edward was already striding to the hall closet, pulling out her coat, shoving it into her hands. "You think you can talk to my guests about water shortages like you're on the board? You think you can question me in my own home? Not happening." The words cut, but it was the cold in his eyes that froze her. She could have begged. She could have pleaded for just one night of shelter. But something inside her, something stronger than fear, snapped. Without a word, she walked to the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble. Guests stepped aside, avoiding her gaze. Edward followed, holding her suitcase as though he couldn't get rid of it fast enough. The elevator doors opened to the private lobby. A gust of wind and rain swirled in from the building's entrance as the doorman tried to hold it shut. "You're insane," she said quietly, finally meeting Edward's gaze. "No," he replied, shoving the suitcase toward her. "I'm done." The doorman looked between them, his brow furrowed. "Mr. Beaumont, it's dangerous out there." "She'll be fine," Edward interrupted. "Call her a cab if you must." Lila stepped into the storm, the cold rain soaking her dress in seconds. Behind her, the heavy glass door swung shut, muting the shocked murmurs of the guests still lingering in the lobby. And that was when it happened. Her heel caught on the slick pavement, her body lurching forward. She twisted to protect her belly, but the impact still sent a shock of pain through her side. The suitcase tumbled into the gutter, water rushing around it. The doorman was already running toward her, his voice urgent. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She struggled to breathe, one hand pressing against her abdomen. The baby moved, but slower than before. "No," she gasped. "I need a hospital, now." By the time she was in the back of a cab, shivering and clutching her belly, she knew two things for certain. The image Edward had built so carefully was about to crack, and she would be the one to swing the hammer. Because this wasn't just cruelty, it was recklessness. And in New York, recklessness that endangered an unborn child could destroy a man. Edward thought throwing her out in the storm would be the end of her story. But it was only the beginning. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and rain-soaked clothing. Lila lay in the narrow bed, the paper-thin blanket doing little to chase away the chill that had settled into her bones. Her damp hair clung to her cheeks, and her dress, still clinging uncomfortably to her skin, was wrinkled from the ride over in the cab. The monitors beside her hummed steadily, one tracking her heart rate, the other measuring the tiny but powerful rhythm of the baby's. The steady thump, thump, thump filled the room, a sound that should have comforted her, but now only reminded her how close she had come to losing everything. Her doctor, a petite woman named Dr. Nguyen, stood at the foot of the bed, flipping through her chart. "You're lucky you came in when you did," she said, her tone calm but firm. "The fall caused some stress on your body, but the baby's heartbeat is strong. We'll keep you for observation tonight, maybe tomorrow, just to be safe." Lila nodded, her throat tight. She had been holding herself together since the moment she hit the pavement, refusing to let the panic take over. But now, in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, the dam began to crack. "What about long-term?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Nguyen's gaze softened. "If you rest, stay warm, and avoid stress, you and the baby should be fine." But she hesitated. "You need stability, Layla. Physical and emotional, falling again, getting too stressed, these aren't risks you can take right now." Stability. The word lodged in her chest like a stone. She had no home to return to, no family nearby, no one she could lean on without feeling like a burden. Edward had made sure of that, subtly pulling her away from anyone who might have been a safety net. When the doctor left, the silence returned, broken only by the rain tapping against the window. Lila turned her head toward the sound. The storm hadn't let up. It howled against the glass, the wind bending the branches of the trees in the parking lot below. She thought about the warm glow of the penthouse she could see from blocks away, the light spilling from the windows like it belonged to another world entirely. A world she'd been thrown out of. Her chest tightened, but it wasn't just grief, it was exhaustion. Her body felt heavy, as though the weight of the last few years had finally decided to settle all at once. She closed her eyes, and the images came in fragments. Edward's face, cool and detached as he shoved the suitcase into her hands, the sharp jolt of pain as she hit the pavement. The guests in the lobby, their eyes sliding away, pretending not to see. She had thought she was strong. She had thought she could weather his cruelty, keep her head down until the baby came. But tonight had proved otherwise. The door opened and a nurse stepped in with a tray. "Dinner," she said softly, setting it on the rolling table beside the bed. The scent of lukewarm broth and overcooked carrots filled the room. "Thanks," Lila murmured, though she had no appetite. The nurse hesitated. "You should eat. The baby needs it." Lila forced herself to take a spoonful, but it felt like ash in her mouth. Every bite reminded her of how far she had fallen, literally and figuratively, in the space of an hour. By the time the nurse left, Lila felt the sting of tears again. She hated crying, hated the way it made her feel small, but she was too tired to stop it. Her phone buzzed on the table. She reached for it, her heart leaping for just a second. Maybe it was her parents. Maybe, ridiculously, Edward had come to his senses. But it was neither. It was a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Beaumont, this is to confirm your cab fare has been charged to your account," her account, the joint account Edward had access to. Even now, he was making sure she felt indebted for every penny. She set the phone down, her hands trembling. The truth was unavoidable. Edward had stripped her of more than her home. He had taken her security, her confidence, even her sense of self. And yet, she wasn't empty. Not completely. Her hand drifted to her belly. The baby shifted, a small but undeniable sign of life. A reminder that she wasn't alone, no matter how much Edward wanted her to feel that way. She took a deep breath. In, out. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. When the world pushes you down, you push back harder. It was a nice sentiment. But right now she didn't feel like she could push at all. She dozed off briefly, waking to the sound of distant thunder. The storm was easing, but the rain still fell steadily. She imagined the streets glistening under the city lights, the puddles reflecting passing cars. Somewhere out there, Edward was likely drinking his imported scotch, laughing with his guests, already moving on from the scene he had caused. The thought made her stomach turn, but it also sparked something else. Anger. It was faint at first, a small ember buried under layers of exhaustion and fear. But the more she thought about his smug expression, the way he had humiliated her in front of others, the warmer that ember grew. She realized then that collapse wasn't the end. It was the bottom, and the only thing you could do from the bottom was start climbing back up. But for now, she had to rest. Not for Edward, not for appearances. She had to rest for the baby. Because the fight ahead would be long, and she needed every ounce of strength she could gather. Her eyes drifted shut again, but this time, she didn't dream of the penthouse. She dreamed of standing in a courtroom, her voice steady, her case airtight, Edward's mask cracking in front of everyone. It was a fantasy. But fantasies had a way of turning into plans. And plans, if you held on to them long enough, had a way of turning into reality. Morning came to the hospital in a pale wash of gray. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low over the city. Lila lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles, tracing the faint cracks like roads on a map. She hadn't slept much. Her mind kept circling back to Edward, his words, his face, the humiliating way he had shoved her into the storm as though she were disposable. The baby kicked, faint but steady. It was the only thing anchoring her. A knock at the door startled her. She expected the nurse with breakfast, but instead, a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, his tie perfectly knotted. "Mrs. Beaumont?" he asked. Lila hesitated. "Yes. Who are you?" "My name's Daniel Reed. I'm an attorney. Your friend Clarissa Vance sent me." Lila blinked. Clarissa? The same woman from last night who'd looked horrified when Edward threw her out? She barely knew her, only exchanged polite words at parties. "She told me what happened," Daniel continued, pulling a slim folder from his leather briefcase. "She also told me you might not realize just how much leverage you have right now." "Leverage?" The word felt foreign in her mouth. Daniel set the folder on her lap. New York State has very specific laws about endangering the welfare of a child. That includes unborn children. If what Clarissa described is accurate, Edward forcing you into dangerous weather resulting in a fall, he could face serious legal consequences. Lila's first instinct was disbelief. "He's Edward Beaumont. He has more lawyers than I have friends. He'll bury this." "Maybe," Daniel said evenly. "But there's more. Did you sign a prenuptial agreement before your marriage?" Lila shook her head. "No. He said it wasn't necessary." Daniel's eyes sharpened. "That's rare. Very rare. It means marital assets are in play, and if you can prove cruelty, abandonment, or reckless endangerment, you could be entitled to a substantial portion of his estate, especially with a child involved." Lila's pulse quickened. She'd never once thought about Edward's money as hers, but hearing it framed as something she could take, not as a gift from him, but as something she had a right to, lit a strange spark inside her. "And there's one more thing," Daniel said, lowering his voice. "I did a little digging this morning. Edward's Dubai project? It's over-leveraged. He's counting on his investors to cover the gap, but if they get wind of a scandal, especially one involving his pregnant wife, it could cost him millions." Lila sat up straighter. "So you're saying?" "I'm saying," Daniel replied, "that you have the power to decide how this plays out. You can walk away quietly, or you can make this very public. Either way, you hold cards Edward doesn't know you have." The room felt warmer, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Lila had spent years shrinking herself to fit Edward's expectations, years believing she had no control. And now, in a single conversation, she could see cracks in the fortress he'd built. She touched the folder. Inside were documents, copies of state statutes, notes on potential witnesses, even a list of reporters who had covered Edward's business dealings. I'm not sure I'm ready for all of this, she admitted. That's okay, Daniel said. You don't have to decide today. Rest. Take care of yourself and your baby. But know this, he's not as untouchable as he thinks. After he left, Lila sat in silence, the hum of the monitors filling the room. She opened the folder, skimming the first page. The words blurred for a moment, not from confusion, but from the rush of adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming something she'd lost long before the storm, her agency. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed. It was Clarissa. Lila, Clarissa said, her voice warm but urgent. I saw the look on your face last night. I know what it's like to be humiliated like that. And I also know Edward's enemies will pay good money for a story like yours. I don't want to sell my story, Lila said quickly. I'm not saying you should, Clarissa replied. I'm saying you have options. You can use the threat of going public to negotiate. You can hit him where it hurts most, his image. Clarissa wasn't a close friend, but her words carried the weight of someone who had navigated similar storms. By the time visiting hours ended, Lila had made a decision, not the final one, but an important step. She wasn't going to disappear quietly. She wasn't going to let Edward decide the narrative. That night, she called Daniel back. If we do this, she said, we do it on my terms, and we make sure he never sees it coming. Understood, Daniel replied. I'll start gathering evidence. In the meantime, keep your head down. Let him think you're still recovering. Lila hung up, her heart pounding. She glanced at the folder again, then at the faint reflection of herself in the darkened hospital window. She still looked tired, still felt fragile. But something in her eyes had changed. Edward thought the storm was the end. He had no idea it was only the warning. 2 weeks after the storm, Lila walked out of the hospital with the slow, deliberate steps of someone still recovering. But the truth was, she was already plotting. Daniel had been visiting her almost daily, bringing updates, strategies, and quiet encouragement. Clarissa had connected her with contacts she never imagined she'd have. People who didn't just gossip about Edward's world, but could dismantle it if given the right push. The first step was simple: disappear. Not in the sense of running away, but of slipping out of Edward's line of sight. She didn't return to Brookhaven. She didn't move into a friend's spare room. Instead, Daniel arranged for her to stay in a private townhouse owned by one of his clients, a retired judge who owed Daniel a favor. The place was quiet, tucked on a leafy street in the West Village, its brick facade unassuming among the row of historic homes. It was here that Lila began to rebuild. The first days were about rest. She slept without fear of Edward barging in, without the constant hum of tension in her muscles. She cooked simple meals for herself. Nothing extravagant, just soups and fresh bread, but the act of making food with her own hands felt grounding. But rest wasn't enough. She needed to feel like herself again, or maybe she needed to become someone new. One afternoon, she stood in front of the townhouse's antique mirror, studying her reflection. The woman staring back at her looked tired. Yes, but also sharper somehow. There was a focus in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She picked up the phone and called a number Clarissa had given her. I need a stylist, she said simply. 2 days later, a woman named Mara arrived, a whirlwind of black leather, blunt bangs, and sharp wit. We're not just buying clothes, Mara said, eyeing Lila critically. We're building armor. They started with basics: tailored trousers, silk blouses, a blazer that made Lila's shoulders look strong. Then came the statement pieces, a scarlet wrap dress that hugged her in all the right places, a pair of heels so perfectly cut they made her feel taller than Edward had ever made her feel small. You're gonna walk into rooms and make him remember exactly who he underestimated, Mara said, pinning the hem of a skirt. Next came her hair. She traded the soft waves Edward had always insisted on for a sleek, shoulder-length cut with subtle highlights that caught the light when she turned her head. It wasn't just a change, it was a statement. With her wardrobe and appearance transforming, Lila turned her focus inward. Daniel had recommended a therapist, someone discreet who understood the dynamics of power and control in relationships like hers. Their sessions were raw at first. She spoke about the isolation, the slow erosion of her confidence, the way Edward had chipped away at her until she barely recognized herself. You're not broken, the therapist said during one session. You've been trained to think you are. There's a difference." The words stuck. Lila began journaling every morning, pouring her thoughts onto paper without censoring them. Some entries were angry, filled with scathing sentences about Edward. Others were quiet reflections on her parents, on Brookhaven, on the life she'd once dreamed of. She didn't know yet which parts of that dream she still wanted, but she knew she would be the one to decide this time. Meanwhile, Daniel was building their case. He gathered witness statements from the doorman, from Clarissa, even from Simon Aldridge, who admitted under oath that Edward had mocked Lila's concerns during dinner. Medical records documented her fall, the hospital stay, the stress it had caused. One evening, Daniel spread the files across the townhouse's dining table. "If we push this into the courts, he'll try to settle quickly to avoid the press. But if he doesn't—" He looked up. "We'll be ready to go public." Lila ran her fingers over the edges of the papers. "I don't just want money," she said quietly. "I want him exposed. I want people to see what he really is." Daniel's mouth twitched in the faintest smile. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." But exposure required precision. They couldn't rush. Lila spent the next few weeks preparing not just for legal battle, but for the inevitable public one. She learned how to handle reporters, how to answer questions without giving away too much. She practiced her posture, her voice, even her expressions in the mirror. "This isn't about revenge," her therapist reminded her one afternoon. "It's about reclaiming your narrative." Lila understood. But she also knew that reclaiming her narrative meant showing Edward and everyone watching that she was no longer the woman he'd thrown into the storm. By the time February rolled around, the West Village townhouse no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a launch pad. The baby's arrival was just weeks away, but she felt stronger than she had in years. Her body was heavier, yes, but her spirit felt light. The final step in her transformation came unexpectedly. Mara had found a vintage watch in a small boutique, gold, with a delicate face and a subtle engraving on the back. Time reveals all things. When Lila fastened it around her wrist, she knew it was more than an accessory. It was a reminder. Edward's time was running out. On a brisk Thursday morning, Daniel called with the update she'd been waiting for. "He's having another investor dinner next week," he said. "It's public enough for word to spread, private enough for you to walk in and take the room. Are you ready?" Lila looked at herself in the mirror. The scarlet dress, the gold watch, the eyes that no longer flinched. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." Edward thought the storm had washed her away. But storms don't just destroy. Sometimes they clear the air. And she was about to make sure everyone saw the sky afterward. The Beaumont penthouse looked exactly as it had the night she'd been thrown out. Polished, immaculate, every detail staged like a photograph. But this time, Lila wasn't standing outside in the rain. She was stepping out of a black town car, heels clicking against the marble of the private entrance. The doorman straightened the moment he saw her. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said softly, almost as if it were an apology. She smiled faintly. Not for long. Inside, the elevator hummed as it carried her to the 60th floor. Her reflection in the mirrored walls was everything Edward wouldn't expect. Poised, radiant, untouchable. The scarlet wrap dress hugged her curves, the gold watch at her wrist catching the light. When the doors opened, she stepped into the familiar scent of imported lilies. Voices drifted from the dining room, laughter ringing out over the clink of glasses. Edward was in his element. She didn't announce herself. She walked straight through the living room, every step deliberate. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and then Edward saw her. For a moment, his confident smile faltered, replaced by something sharper, panic. But he recovered quickly, setting down his glass. "Well," he said, his voice carrying over the room, "look who decided to crash the party." "I'm not crashing," Lila replied, her tone calm, even warm. "I was invited." Murmurs rippled through the guests. Edward's eyes flicked toward Clarissa, who stood near the bar, her expression unreadable. "You've made your point, Lila," Edward said, his voice low but taut. "We don't need to do this here." "Oh, I think we do," she said. She stepped closer to the table, resting a hand lightly on the back of an empty chair. "Because last time we were all together, you made a point too, by throwing your pregnant wife out into a storm." The room went silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside. Edward chuckled, but it was forced. We're not airing personal disagreements in front of my guests. This isn't a disagreement, Lila said, pulling a folded sheet of paper from her clutch. This is a notice of intent to sue for reckless endangerment, emotional distress, and abandonment. Copies have already been sent to your legal team and the press. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others stared openly, their curiosity piqued. Edward's jaw tightened. You think this will scare me? I think it will ruin you, she said plainly. And not just in court. Your investors might want to know how you treat the people closest to you, especially when you're asking them to trust you with their money. She let the words hang in the air, watching them sink in. Across the table, Simon Aldridge's expression had changed, measured, calculating. Clarissa was smiling now, just slightly. Edward glanced around, clearly noting the shifting mood. This is a stunt, he said. She's exaggerating. Ask the doorman, Lila interrupted. Ask Clarissa, ask the cab driver who had to carry me to the hospital. There are witnesses, Edward, and there's a baby involved. Judges tend to care about that. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Lila leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough that people had to strain to hear. You spent years making me small, controlling me, making me believe I had no power. But here's the thing about storms. They don't destroy everything. Sometimes they wash away the dirt so the truth can shine through. She straightened, letting her gaze sweep the room. I'm not here to beg for anything. I'm here to tell you that I'm done playing your perfect wife for the cameras. I'm done being a prop in your story. From now on, I write the script. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Simon Aldridge stood. Edward, he said, his tone cool, I think we should postpone our discussion about Dubai. Others began to murmur their goodbyes. Chairs scraped against the marble floor. One by one, the guests began to leave, some without meeting Edward's eyes. Edward turned back to Lila, his face pale now. You think you've won something here? She smiled. Not the tight, polite smile he was used to, but a genuine one. I've already won. You just don't know it yet. She stepped past him, her heels clicking with the same steady rhythm they had when she walked in. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back. Oh, she added, her tone light, you might want to check the news before dessert. The headline's a killer. By the time the elevator doors closed behind her, her phone buzzed. It was Daniel. They're running it, he said. Front page by morning. Lila exhaled slowly, her grip on the phone loosening. Outside, the city lights glittered, reflected in the glass as the elevator descended. She had walked back into Edward's world and left it in pieces. And for the first time in years, she felt free. 3 months later, spring had returned to New York. The air was warmer, the trees along the West Village streets budding with new leaves. Lila sat at a small cafe table by the window, her newborn daughter asleep in a stroller beside her. She cradled a cup of tea, watching the city bustle past with a calm she hadn't felt in years. The trial had been swift by legal standards. Just 6 weeks from the day Daniel filed the case to the day the judge delivered the verdict. Edward's lawyers had fought hard to paint her as emotional, unstable, prone to exaggeration. But the evidence told a different story. Hospital records, eyewitness accounts, even security footage from the lobby showing Edward shoving her suitcase into her arms as the storm raged outside. The jury didn't take long. They found Edward guilty of reckless endangerment and emotional distress, awarding Lila a settlement large enough to ensure she and her child would never want for anything. The money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was in the way the verdict stripped Edward's mask in public. Newspapers ran headlines about the millionaire who endangered his pregnant wife. Investors began pulling out of his Dubai project, citing ethical concerns. Invitations to galas and fundraisers dried up almost overnight. She hadn't needed to shout or scheme. She had simply told the truth and made sure the right people heard it. Daniel joined her at the cafe that morning, a manila envelope in hand. Final paperwork, he said, sliding it across the table. Once you sign this, it's official. You're no longer Mrs. Edward Beaumont. Lila looked at the papers for a long moment before picking up the pen. Her signature was steady, deliberate. With each stroke, it felt as though she was closing the last chapter of a book she'd been trapped in for too long. When she set the pen down, Daniel smiled. You did it. We did it, she corrected. I couldn't have done this alone. As he left, Lila turned her attention back to her daughter, who stirred softly in her sleep. She reached down, brushing a fingertip across the baby's tiny hand. "You'll never know the kind of man he was," she whispered. "But you'll know the kind of woman I became." That night, she took a walk through the city. The lights glittered above her, the streets alive with energy. She passed by the Orion, the tower that had once felt like a gilded cage, and for the first time she felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just release. In her mind she could still hear her mother's voice. "When the world pushes you down, you push back harder." She had been pushed to the pavement, into fear, into isolation. But she had pushed back, and in doing so she had built a new life, one not defined by Edward's wealth or control. She stopped at a crosswalk, looking up at the skyline. Somewhere out there, Edward was probably nursing what remained of his pride, trying to rebuild his empire without the trust he'd once commanded so easily. She didn't wish him well, but she didn't wish him harm either. His downfall was his own doing, and he would have to live with it. Back at the townhouse, she settled into the nursery she'd decorated herself. Soft yellow walls, shelves lined with storybooks, a rocking chair by the window. It wasn't as big as the penthouse, but it was warm. It was home. As she rocked her daughter to sleep, she thought about the women who might be watching her story unfold in the news, women who were still trapped in their own storms. She wished she could tell each of them the truth she had learned. You don't have to be fearless to fight back. You just have to take the first step. Before bed, she scrolled through her phone and found an email from a nonprofit she'd reached out to weeks earlier. They specialized in helping women leave abusive relationships, providing shelter, legal aid, and counseling. They had written back with an offer, a seat on their board. She accepted immediately. The next morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, holding her daughter in her arms. She barely recognized the woman looking back, not because of the new haircut or the clothes, but because of the way her shoulders no longer slumped, the way her eyes no longer darted toward the door in fear. She was no longer waiting for someone else to decide her future. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. Edward Beaumont had officially withdrawn from the Dubai project, citing personal matters. The article was brief, almost clinical, but it ended with a single line that made her smile. Mr. Beaumont could not be reached for comment. She put the phone down and opened the window, letting in the crisp morning air. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, mingling with the honk of cabs and the chatter of pedestrians. Life was moving forward, and so was she. That night, as she lay in bed, the baby sleeping peacefully in a bassinet beside her, she whispered a quiet promise into the dark. "We're going to be okay. Better than okay. We're going to build something beautiful." And for the first time since the storm, she believed it completely. So the story has ended, my wonderful friends. And if you're still here right now, it means something deep inside you has been touched. Maybe it's the reminder that even in storms, we can find our strength. As the saying goes, the wound is the place where the light enters you. If this journey moved you, then like, share, leave me your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so we can keep walking through these stories together.